Okay, so we are still in July of 30 AD. Subtext: Jesus preaching on the mountain near Berotha. Sunday, July 16th, 30 AD. We are Tammuz the 26th. Before daybreak of the night between the Sabbath and Sunday, Jesus left Adama. He had taken leave of the people after the exercises of the Sabbath, though without saying that he was not to return, and he now went with his disciples and several of the Jews to the mountain appointed for instruction. He left Adama by the gate through which he had entered, and that was over a bridge. Had they gone by another, they would have had to ferry over the river that ran from Ador to Kadesh, and which near Adama flowed into the Jordan. They left Kadesh to the right and proceeded westward over gently rising mountain terraces. This region had high mountain ridges that formed great plateaus. There were fewer ravines and isolated peaks than in southern Palestine. Thisbe was to the left of the little troop on very high ground. Tobias once lived in Thisbe and had there given in marriage his wife's brother or brother-in-law. He had also been in Machaerus, the water city. He might have taken up his abode there permanently, were it not that he preferred to go into captivity in order to be useful to his people. Elijah too had been in Thisbe, and Jesus had once before journeyed through it. The multitude was already gathered upon the mountain. On the preceding evening, people had gone thither after the Sabbath and put the place in order. On the summit was an enclosed space in which stood a teacher's chair. The people living on the sides of the mountain had been busied preparing for the tents, and already the stakes and cords were at hand. They had carried them up and stretched the awnings over the teacher's chair and other available spots around. The place was one of historic interest, for Joshua had here celebrated a feast of thanksgiving after his successful siege of the Canaanites. Water had been transported hither in leathern bottles and bread and fish in baskets. These baskets were like our beehives. They could be placed one above another, and in the several compartments various things could be put without danger of mixing. As Jesus was going up through the crowd to the summit of the mountain, shouts greeted him on every side. "Thou art the true prophet, the helper," etc. And as he passed along, they bowed low before him. It may have been 9 o'clock when he reached the summit, for it was 6 to 7 hours from Adama to this place. Many possessed had been led up the mountain. They were raging and shouting. When Jesus saw them, he commanded them silence, and by his command and the glance of his eye, they became calm and were freed from the evil one. When Jesus had reached the tribune, and the crowd had been brought to order and silenced by the disciples, he first invoked his heavenly Father, from whom come all good gifts, the people likewise praying. Then he began his instruction. He made allusion to what had there occurred, spoke of the children of Israel, of Joshua's once appearing in these parts and freeing them from the Canaanites and from paganism, and of the destruction of Azor. Of all these events, Jesus explained the spiritual meaning. Thus came truth and light to them anew, with grace and mildness to free them from the power of sin. He exhorted them not to resist as did the Canaanites, that God's punishment might not come upon them as it had done upon Azor. He also related a parable of which he again made use on a later occasion. It is in the book of the Gospels, I think, something about wheat and husbandry. He taught also of penance and the coming of the kingdom, speaking significantly of himself and the heavenly Father as he had done in the neighboring towns. The sons of Johanna, Chuza, and Veronica came here to Jesus. They had been sent by Lazarus to warn him against the 2 spies whom the Pharisees had dispatched from Jerusalem to Adama. The disciples brought them to Jesus during a pause in the instruction. He told them not to be at all disquieted on his account, that he would fulfill his mission, and he thanked them for their devotedness, etc. The spies sent by the Pharisees were also on the mountain with the disaffected Jews from Adama. Jesus did not address them, but he said aloud in the course of his instruction that enemies would lie in wait for him and persecute him. Still, they would not succeed in hindering him from accomplishing what the Father in heaven had entrusted to him. He would soon appear among them again to announce the kingdom of God and the truth. Many mothers were present with their children, demanding Jesus' blessing, but the disciples were disquieted and thought, on account of the presence of the spies, that he should not give it. Jesus, however, reproved them for their anxiety, saying that he regarded the intention of the mothers as good, and that the children would thereby derive benefit. So he went down through the rows that they formed and gave them his benediction. The instruction lasted from 10 in the morning till near evening, when the people were ranged in order to take some food. On one side of the mountain there were grated fires whereon the fish were roasted. The order observed was beautiful. Not only the inhabitants of each separate city encamped together, but even the residents of the same streets were divided into families with their neighbors. To the guests of each street, one man was appointed to bring and divide the food. Each person, or one person in each group, had a leather cover which, being spread out, served for plates. They had with them also such things as are used at a table, bone knives and spoons with jointed handles. Some had brought gourds, others cups of bark, in which they received water from the leathern bottles, while others there and then quickly formed for themselves such cups if they had not done so on the way. The superintendents received the food from the disciples and divided each portion among the 4 or 5 sitting together, laying the fish and bread on the leathern cover before them. Jesus had blessed the food before it was divided, and by virtue of that blessing it was multiplied. Otherwise it would have been far from sufficient for the 2,000 for whom it was intended. Each group received a small portion only, but all were satisfied after eating, and much remained over to be collected into baskets and carried off by the poor. There were some Roman soldiers going around among the crowd. They knew either Lentulus in Rome or had instructions from him, for he had soldiers under his command. Perhaps they had been charged to bring him information of Jesus, for they went to the disciples and begged some of the blessed bread to take with them to Lentulus. On receiving it, they stowed it away in the knapsacks that hung from their shoulders. It was already dark, and torches lighted when the meal was over. Jesus blessed the multitude and left the mountain with the disciples, from whom, however, he soon separated. They took a shorter route back to Bethsaida and Capernaum, while he, with Saturnin and that disciple, his relative, went southward to a city lying off from Berotha called Zidad, and spent the night at the inn outside the city. I'm going to read a second subtext because it's only a page. This is the subtext. Jesus passes through Gath Hepher to Capernaum. We are Monday, July 17th. On the night between Monday and Tuesday, I saw Jesus in the mountains with Saturnin and that other disciple. As he walked alone in prayer, they questioned him about it. He spoke to them of prayer in private, illustrating by the example of the serpent and scorpion. Were a child to ask for a fish, the father would not give him a scorpion, etc. Tuesday, July 18th. During these days, I saw him again in various little places among the shepherds, healing and exhorting, also in Gath Hepher, Jonas's birthplace and where some of his own relatives live. He wrought cures in this latter place also, and then toward evening went as far as Capernaum. How indefatigable was Jesus! With what ardor he inspired the disciples and apostles. At first they were often overcome by fatigue, but now what a difference! The disciples, when traveling along the highways, went forward to meet some and to hunt up with the others, to instruct themselves or invite them to attend Jesus' instructions. Lazarus, Obed, Joseph of Arimathea's nephews, the bridegroom of Cana, and some other disciples had arrived at Mary's house near Capernaum. There were present also about 7 women, relatives and friends, awaiting the return of Jesus. They went in and out of the house and gazed along the road to catch the first sight of him. And now came some of John's disciples with the news of their master's imprisonment, which filled the hearts of the little company with anxiety. The disciples went on to meet Jesus, with whom they came up not far from Capernaum, and made known to them their errand. He consoled them and continued his way to his mother's alone. He had sent his disciples on in advance. Lazarus came out to meet him and washed his feet in the vestibule. When Jesus entered the apartment, the men bowed low before him. He greeted them and went up to his mother, to whom he stretched out his hands. She, too, most lovingly and humbly inclined to him. There was no rushing into each other's arms. Their meetings was full of tender and ingenuous reserve, which touched all present and made upon them the holiest impression. Then Jesus turned toward the other women, who lowered their veils and sank on their knees before him. He was accustomed to give his blessing at such meetings and leave-takings. I saw now a repast made ready, and the men reclining around the table, the women at one end sitting cross-legged. They spoke indignantly of John's imprisonment, but Jesus rebuked them. He said that they should not be angry and pass sentence upon it, for that it had to be. Were John not removed from the scene, he himself would not be able to begin his work and go to Bethany. Then he told them of the people among whom he had been. Of Jesus' coming none knew excepting those present and the other confidential disciples. Jesus slept with the other guests in a side building. He appointed the disciples to meet him under the next Sabbath at the house, high and solitary in the neighborhood of Beth Horon. Wednesday, July 19th. We are the last day of Tammuz, I think. Tammuz 29. I saw Jesus conversing with Mary alone. She was weeping at the thought of his exposing himself to danger by going to Jerusalem. He comforted her, telling her that she must not be anxious, that he would accomplish his mission, and that the sorrowful days had not yet come. He encouraged her to persevere in prayer and exhorted the others to refrain from all comments and judgments upon John's imprisonment and the action of the Pharisees against himself, for such proceedings on their part would only increase the danger, adding that the Pharisees' manner of acting was permitted by divine providence, though they were thereby working out their own destruction. Some mention was made of Magdalene also. Jesus again told them to pray for her and think of her kindly, for she would soon be converted and become so good as to be an example for many. That morning Jesus went to Bethany with Lazarus and about 5 of the disciples belonging to Jerusalem. It was the beginning of the feast of the new moon, and I saw floating from the synagogues of Capernaum and other places long streamers of knotted drapery and festoons of fruit on the principal houses. All right, so I'm going to read the next subtitle as well because it deals with John the Baptist's arrest. So, subtext. John the Baptist arrested by Herod and imprisoned at Machaerus. Herod had once before caused the Baptist to be arrested at the place of baptism and brought to him. where he kept him in custody some weeks in the hope of intimidating him and leading him to a change of sentiment. But through fear of the immense crowds that were hurrying to hear John, he had released him. John then retired to the place where he had formerly baptized near Aenon and opposite Salem. It was about 1 hour and a half east of the Jordan and about 2 hours south of Sukkoth. The baptismal well was in the region of a lake, about a quarter of an hour long, from which 2 streams, after bathing the foot of a hill, flowed into the Jordan. On this hill were the remains of an old castle, whose towers were still habitable, and scattered around were gardens and walks and other dwellings. Between the lake and the hill was John's baptismal well. In the center of the spacious cauldron-shaped summit at the hill, John's disciples had raised an awning over the terraced elevation formed of stone, and it was there that he taught. This region was under Philip's jurisdiction, but it ran like a point into Herod's country, who on that account was somewhat reserved in executing his designs against John. An uncommonly great concourse of people had assembled to hear John, whole caravans from Arabia on camels and asses, and hundreds of people from Jerusalem and all Judea, both men and women. The crowds came and went by turns, covered the cauldron-shaped plateau, and camped at the base of the hill and stood on the heights around. The most beautiful order was established and maintained by John's disciples. Those nearest the preacher reclined on the ground, those behind them sat on their heels. While the other rows stood in this way, all could see. The pagans were separated from the Jews, and the men from the women, who always stood back on the last row. On the slope of the hill were other groups squatting, head and arms resting on their knees, or again clasping one knee and lying or sitting on the other hip. Since his return from Herod, John was, as if penetrated by a new spirit. His voice sounded usually sweet, and yet was so powerful and far-reaching that every word was understood. He again wore his mantle of skins, and was more roughly clothed than at Ono, where he had sometimes appeared in a flowing robe. His teaching was of Jesus and his persecution in Jerusalem. Pointing toward Upper Galilee, where Jesus was at that instant going about working miraculous cures, John said, "But he will soon reappear in these parts. His persecutors will gain nothing over him until his mission shall have been fulfilled." Herod also and his wife came with a guard of soldiers to John's place of instruction. He had traveled from his castle of Livius, 12 hours passing near Dibon, where he had to cross 2 branches of a little river. As far as Dibon, the road was good, but after that it became very rough and difficult, properly speaking, fit only for foot passengers and beasts of burden. Herod rode upon a long, narrow chariot, on which one could recline or sit sideways. There were several with him. The wheels proper were heavy, low, round discs without spokes, though there were other larger ones and rollers in the back. The road was so uneven that on one side the chariot rested on the high wheels, and on the other upon low ones. The journey was a painful one. Herod's wife, along with her ladies in waiting, rode upon a similar chariot. They were drawn by asses, preceded and followed by soldiers and courtiers. Herod had undertaken this journey because John was now preaching again, and that more boldly and zealously than before. He was anxious to hear him and learn whether he said anything personally against himself. His wife was only waiting for an opportunity to excite him to extreme measures against John. She hid her crafty designs, however, under a fair appearance. Herod had still another motive in making this journey. He knew that the Arabian king Aretas, father of his repudiated first wife, had come hither to John and, to escape observation, had mingled with the disciples. He wanted to see whether Aretas had any design to stir up the people against himself. His first wife, a good and very beautiful lady, had returned to her father, who, having heard of John's teaching and of his opposition to Herod's unlawful desires, had come to satisfy himself of the truth of what had been told him. But, anxious to attract no attention, he was dressed simply, like John's disciples, with whom he identified himself. Herod alighted at the old castle on the hill and sat during John's instruction upon the graded terrace in front. His wife, surrounded by her guards and attendants, sat on cushions under an awning. John was preaching in a loud voice, and at that moment crying out to the people that they should not be scandalized at Herod's second union, that they should honor him without imitating him. These words pleased Herod at first, though on second thought they irritated him. The force with which John spoke was indescribable. His voice was like thunder, and yet sweet and intelligible. He seemed to be exerting himself for the last time. He had already warned his disciples that his days were drawing to a close, but that they should not abandon him. They should visit him when in prison. For 3 days he had neither eaten nor drunk. The whole time had been spent in teaching, proclaiming aloud his testimony to Jesus, and in rebuking Herod for his adultery. The disciples implored him to discontinue and take a little nourishment, but he listened not. He was wholly under the spirit of inspiration. The view from the height upon which John taught was uncommonly beautiful. One could see off in the distance the Jordan, the cities lying around, fields and orchards. There must have been here, in days gone by, a great building, for I could still see stone arches like those of bridges overgrown with thick green moss. 2 of the towers of the castle at which Herod stopped had been lately restored, and it was in them that he lodged. This region was rich in springs, and the baths were kept in perfect order. The water that supplied them was brought through a skillfully constructed vaulted canal from the hill upon whose summit John taught. The baptismal pool was oval in form and encircled by 3 beautiful green terraces through which 5 pathways were cut. This region was indeed much smaller, but richer in appearance than that of Bethsaida at Jerusalem, which is here and there rendered unsightly and impure by reeds and by the leaves that fall into it from the surrounding trees. The baptismal pool lay behind the hill, and about 150 feet beyond was the great pond in which were numbers of fish. They seemed to be crowding to the side at which John was teaching, as if they wanted to hear. On the pond were little skiffs, trunks of trees hollowed out, large enough at most for 2 men only, with seats in the middle for fishing. John ate only a little poor honey. When he took food with the disciples, it was always in very small quantities. He prayed alone and spent most of the night gazing up to heaven. John knew that the time of his arrest was near, therefore he had spoken as if under inspiration and as if taking leave of his auditors. He had announced Jesus more clearly than ever. He was now coming, he said. Consequently, he himself should retire, and they should go to Jesus. He, John, was soon to be apprehended. They were, he continued, addressing his audience, a hard and indocile people. They should recall how he had come at first and prepared the ways for the Lord. He had built bridges, made footpaths, cleared away stones, arranged baptismal pools, and conducted thither the water. He had a difficult task, struggling against stony earth, hard rocks, and knotty wood. And these labors he had to continue toward a people stubborn, obdurate, and unpolished. But they whom he had stirred up should now go to the Lord, to the well-beloved Son of the Father. They whom he had received would be truly received. They whom he rejected should indeed be rejected. He was coming now to teach, to baptize, to perfect what he himself had prepared. Then turning toward Herod, John earnestly reproached him several times before the people for his scandalous connection. Herod, who both reverenced and feared him, was inwardly furious, though preserving a cool exterior. The instruction was ended, and the crowd began to disperse on all sides, the people from Arabia and Aretas, Herod's father-in-law, going with them. Herod had not caught sight of him. Herod's wife had already gone, and now he himself departed, concealing his rage and taking a friendly leave of John. John sent several disciples to different quarters with messages, dismissed the others, and retired to his tent to give himself up to prayer. It was already dark, and the disciples had departed, when about 20 soldiers, after placing guards on all sides, surrounded the tent, and one entered. John told him that he would follow quietly, that he knew his time had come, that he must make way for Jesus. They needed not to fetter him, for he would willingly accompany them, and that, in order to avoid a tumult, they should lead him away with as little noise as possible. And so the 20 men hurried him off at a rapid pace. He had only his rough mantle of skins thrown about him and his staff in his hand. Some of his disciples met him as he was being led away. He took leave of them with a glance and bade them visit him in his imprisonment. But soon the disciples and the people mobbed together and cried aloud, "They have arrested John!" And then arose weeping and lamentations. They wanted to follow, but they knew not what direction to take, for the soldiers had turned quickly out of the usual way and proceeded southward by an unknown route. Intense excitement, grief, and mourning prevailed. The disciples scattered and fled in all quarters, just as they did later at the time of Jesus' arrest, and the news was soon spread throughout the whole country. After marching with the soldiers the whole night, John was conducted first to a tower at Hesebon. Toward morning, some soldiers of the place came to meet the prisoner, for it was already known there that John had been arrested, and the people were gathering together in groups. The soldiers who had charge of John seemed to be a kind of bodyguard to Herod. They wore helmets, their breasts and shoulders protected by armor formed of metal plates and rings, and they bore long lances in their hands. The people of Hesebon gathered in crowds before John's prison, and the guards had enough to do to drive them off. The upper part of the tower had several exterior openings. John stood in his prison, crying in a voice loud enough to be heard without. His words were to this effect: that he had prepared the ways, had broken rocks, had directed streams, had dug fountains, had built bridges. He had to cope with obstacles the most adverse and contradictory, and it was owing to the obstinacy of those whom he now addressed that he had been arrested. But they should turn to him whom he had announced, to him who should soon come by the paths he himself had made straight. When the master approached, then should they who had prepared his way withdraw, and all should turn to Jesus, the latchets of whose shoes he himself was not worthy to loose. Jesus, he continued, is the light, the truth, and the Son of the Father, etc. He called upon his disciples to visit him in his confinement, for no one would yet venture to lay hands upon him. His hour was not yet come. John uttered the above in a voice as loud, as distinct, as if he were addressing the multitude from the orator's stand. Again and again the guard dispersed the crowd, but the throng soon reassembled, and John's instruction recommenced. He was afterward led by the soldiers from Hesebon to the prisoner of Machaerus, the access to which was up a high and steep mountain. He rode with several in a low, narrow, covered chariot like a box drawn by asses. Arrived at Machaerus, the soldiers conducted him up the steep mountain path to the fortress. But they did not enter by the principal gate, but through a postern in the wall nearby, which overhanging moss almost concealed. Traversing a passage somewhat inclined, they reached a brazen door which opened into another that ran under the gateway of the fortress, and thence led into a large underground vault. It was lighted from above and was clean, though destitute of every kind of comfort. From that place of baptism, Herod went to his castle, the Herodium, which had been built by Herod the elder, and where once, for mere sport, he had caused some persons to be drowned in a pond. Here, filled with dejection, Herod hid himself away and would see nobody, although many had already presented themselves to express to him their disapproval of John's arrest. A prey to the inquietude, he shut himself up in his own apartments. After some time, John's disciples, provided they came in small numbers, were allowed to approach the prison, converse with him, and pass things to him through the grating. But if many came together, they were turned away by the guards. John ordered the disciples to go on baptizing at Aenon until Jesus came to establish himself there for the same purpose. The prison was large and well lighted, but its only resting place was a stone bench. John was very serious. His countenance always wore an expression of thoughtfulness and sadness. He looked like one that loved and heralded the Lamb of God, but who knew the bitter death in store for him. And here is where I'll finally end the reading. I know it carried on a bit long, but I figured that this reading had more to do, like this subtext had more to do with the last than the one that's coming up. So I decided to tag it onto this one. That's fine. All right, so my notes. I'm going to dote on one particular subject, and it's more to do with the latter reading rather than what's going on with John the Baptist. Because I didn't really have any notes on John the Baptist other than the fortress. The fortress sounds almost like a fictional castle, right? It's how you picture jails in like cartoons and stuff like that. Like thunder in the background, a castle in the middle of a big high moor and whatnot. Like sometimes I wonder if some of the facts were exaggerated just for access, or whether it was really like this. But either way, it doesn't matter, because it should function as an effective rhetorical tool. Maybe angels designed it this way. Maybe like in the times, in the 500 years leading up to the advent of Christ, it wasn't just John preparing his way. It was the angels. They're like, okay, we need a really cool, because they knew John the Baptist was going to be his basically his crier, his herald. So they're like, all right, we need to dramatize John's life as much as possible, just like we're dramatizing Jesus's life. So we're going to inspire workers to build this really cool castle over on this hill, and it's going to serve as a really dark and deep dungeon with secret passages and everything. It's like, okay, this is interesting. But again, this'll fit the narrative I'm trying to push. So the first major note about the spies. God obviously can't be surprised, and he knows everything that's going on. People, of course, didn't know this about him, nor do they assume it. They probably figured it out eventually, but they didn't know it at first. So Jesus has his own intelligence community, apparently, his own spies, but it's not for his own sake, but for theirs. Jesus said to Peter, "Do you not think that I could call upon a legion of angels to protect me?" This was when he was being arrested the night before his crucifixion. Jesus could also use a legion of angels as intelligence, or simply use his beatific vision, call upon God the Father, and to reveal it to him, and it doesn't matter. It's not that Jesus needed his own intelligence committee, but that people might work around him like he was the king in a kingdom, and they practiced this. If we treated Jesus like our king, what do you suppose his taxes would be upon us? What would you suppose our service would be to him? What would your individual service be to him? Have you paid your taxes? Are you thankful he is king? Or do we live in a different form of governance in that? No matter what, God has it covered. So we often romanticize the time of Christ's advent. The intelligence, the spies, the preaching, the healing, etc. We see order, structure, and it gives us an aura of peace. I remember just enjoying movies like Jesus of Nazareth, especially in his ministry, the parts of the movie involving his ministry, because it spread upon me a calm untormentedness by like an aura that protected me from the devils that haunted my mind, and the devils do routinely haunt my mind. Though there are a lot of errors in Jesus of Nazareth, and so many so that I find the movie unwatchable now. So that means that Jesus is sort of playing a part, playing pretend with the people around him. And this is in real life. But then you must realize by now, after all this time, that this is the world we're living in is a world of pretend. And that the true world is in eternity. You are embodying the avatar of your soul. What you do here, that is, the decisions you make, would echo the kinds of decisions you would make in eternity. So you have to play your part in this grand play and do it well, because it is like an audition for the greater role that is in heaven. So the next note, and this is a continuation of the first, as for whether or not Jesus was in trouble, God knew all. Christ could openly challenge them, but he knew so much about him that he knew so much about his enemies that he knew exactly the line he could walk but not cross. And he crossed that line at a very specific time during the Passover, apparently in 33 AD. Even if it is, and that said, if you have a mission given to you by God, you wonder, can my mission be endangered by the devil and his agents? Will I cross that precipice accidentally? Will I be killed? But even if you are, even if your mission was prematurely ended, know that because you're auditioning for the part, God already knew it was in your heart the whole time. And even if you died before accomplishing it, especially if you got baptized, God will know what you have done. And it's unfortunately what we have to think about when we think about abortion and the amount of souls that don't even get to see their pilgrimage, that don't even get to see themselves embodied, that they don't even get to see their avatar walk upon this earth. When evil executes its plans, it's to cover up the grace of God. But if a powerful enough conduit comes along, no amount of darkness can put out the light of a small, small candle. And so it's these resilient flames God is looking for, no matter how bright. As long as you are an effective candle, he will keep you lit with faith. Now, continuing on the sake of appearances, Mary herself was anxious for Jesus to fulfill his mission. And openly and outwardly so, but here's a big question. Was her behavior for her own sake or for the sake of others? Now, he was talking to her alone, so obviously she knew she had no personal witnesses, but then she would have known, and so would he, that Anne Catherine Emmerich would have been a witness to this exchange. And so she still has to play her part, though they're in private. Doesn't matter. We do not truly know the workings of the Mother of God because her majestic humility veils the amount of power and wisdom she truly possesses. Therefore, we accept, for the sake of appearances, that she was anxious, that she was worried about her son's journey because she played the role of his mother. But the more you figure out about her, the more you realize that she is the best actress of all, and that she played her role so convincingly that it defeated the devil at the foot of the cross. So, I don't know if these kinds of thoughts will help people understand what kind of world they're living in and help empower them to conquer evil or to at least serve God in order to do so. I don't know, but in case it does, I say them anyway. Ave Maria.